and I'll mute myself after I finish.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. The topic is the new vehicle efficiency standard, and we have three excellent speakers who are very well informed on this subject. My name's David Nash. I'm the Secretary of the ITE-ANZ, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session. Firstly, an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the respect the Treaty of Waitangi and the Maori as the original peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So just in case you don't know much about the ITE is an association of transport professionals, mostly engineers, but also planners and other people involved in the transport profession. And we work to improve mobility and safety for all transport system users across all modes and help to build smart and livable communities. There are many thousands of members across 75 countries. ITE is mostly based in North America, but we are the Australian and New Zealand section. New members are, of course, always welcome. We'd like to thank our sponsors who are listed on this slide, and they help us keep the ITE alive in this part of the world and also make sure that we can offer webinars such as this one free to all who want to come along. So today we have three excellent presenters, Scott Alleron, Jake Whitehead and Elliot Fishman. So without any further ado, I'll go to Scott to be the first speaker. And just a little bit about Scott. He's a PhD and a chartered civil engineer and economist with 35 years experience in infrastructure planning, design and economics. He's director of 6CATS Consulting and previously worked for Jacobs in Adelaide and the Queensland Transport and Main Roads in transport planning roles, focusing on active transport, public transport, particularly light rail, business cases and transport economics. And for his sins, he's also the chair of the Transport Australia Society. So over to you, Scott.
Thanks, David. I'll just adjust my slides. First of all, I'd just like to add that I'm speaking to you today from Adelaide, which is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and I acknowledge their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. I pay my respects to them and their culture and to elders past and present. So the section that I'm going to talk about is really the background trends, background economics and the sort of strategic rationale for why we want to electrify the transport sector, in particular light vehicles. I'll leave it to Jake and Elliot to talk about the details of the electric vehicles themselves, the market for them and the impacts on the grid. I'll just talk about the sort of context for that, the transport industry. There's a lot of different sources of information on this. I've got a list of references at the end of these slides. A lot of my views on this were based on a discussion paper that was prepared by the Transport Australia Society, which Engineers Australia kindly published 4 years ago now. It was on climate change and transport, and I guess that was written by a number of our members who were concerned about the lack of policy in this area. And amongst other recommendations, it obviously talks about the need to electrify the transport sector.
Scott, I'm not seeing your slides.
Beg your pardon. Sorry. Is that okay now?
Yeah,
David?
perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I beg your pardon. I realised I clicked it off when practice finished. Sorry. Who says you can have too much practice? Anyway, just to start with, in terms of context, I think most people would be aware that that's a graph of transport of greenhouse gas emissions by industry in Australia over time, with thanks to charting transport and national greenhouse gas emission data. one of the main things to understand is that although electricity generation emissions have been going down in Australia over time, as various states have, with varying speeds, moved towards renewable energy, unfortunately, other industries have been going up, one of which is transport, so much so that the overall net emissions of greenhouse gases from Australia from 2001 to the present are largely the same. They've went up a bit and they've started coming down, but we've really hardly changed from 2001 levels. And I think the first time I wrote a paper on this topic was in 2006, when transport was 16% of Australian emissions. Now it's 21%. So we're an increasing share of the problem. And on current trends, as electricity continues to diminish, as more wind and solar power comes online in Australia, on current trends by 2030, transport will be the #1 source of carbon emissions in Australia. The agriculture, industrial production, that is things like cement and bricks and so on, and transport sectors all see rising emissions. So then moving to within transport itself, it's probably no prizes for guessing that greenhouse gases are not uniform. The road sector, cars and trucks combined, is by far the largest source of transport emissions in Australia. So it's 84%, roughly 50 to 55% by a car or light vehicle, and 30% by truck of varying sizes. Just looking at the other sectors, so aviation is 9%, rail 5%, and marine 2%. Now, bearing in mind that that includes also all of the freight as well as passenger travel, and the vast bulk of freight goes by, certainly in Australia, rail or sea, you can see that really the impact of road travel and transport emissions is disproportionate. So while I'm not saying that it wouldn't be nice to build a high-speed rail network from Sydney to Melbourne to Brisbane, by comparison, it will be far more important to improve our rail freight network and get trucks off the road. And even more important still, to deal with all of the cars we have in our cities and regional areas. And if we look then at per capita trends, like to understand why is transport going up overall, the first thing to say is that the actual per capita passenger kilometres travelled in Australia it has been relatively stable. So car emissions per person per year actually peaked in about 2004. So since then, car use has fallen slightly, although it's fairly flat. Aviation has been fairly steady after a long growth period up to about the early 2010s. Bus per capita has fallen slightly. That doesn't mean that individuals necessarily use bus less, but our provision of bus and public transport has generally not kept track with population growth. Train was trending up until COVID. All forms of public transport took a marked dip down during COVID, and they haven't returned yet to their former levels, except for aviation. By now, it's probably returned to former levels. But the main thing is that population growth is the major driver. And I guess that actually highlights that although we need solutions in terms of transport, electrification and solutions for public transport, we really need a growth strategy, in my view. In Australia, we tend to have separate plans for transport, for population, for employment, and so on. But a coordinated plan is essential if we're going to solve all the dimensions of this problem. So that being said, if we look at the individual components of road transport, again, car usage has gone up slowly, but the biggest components by far of growth in road use have come from light commercial vehicles and trucks, which have both more than doubled since 1990. And so again, we're certainly going to talk about electric vehicles and electric light vehicles in this, but it's also critical that we have a strategy for what to do with freight and what to do with all of the trucks on our road in the long term. And so, again, if you look at emissions per vehicle kilometre, having said that car usage has probably peaked and perhaps even fallen slightly, car emissions, that is emissions per vehicle kilometre, are really a bit of a two-edged problem. That average emission figure there, this is from data by Chris Loader at the Charting Transport blog, which I thoroughly recommend. I steal all the best graphs from him. All jokes aside, Chris has been one of our great members in TAS. That figure of 246 grams of carbon per kilometre travelled for Australia's cars, that's a relatively high figure. And although the cars themselves, like passenger sedan cars, are trending down, the shift to more and more utes, SUVs, and generally larger vehicles is tending to negate any benefits from the passenger cars becoming more efficient. So there is still a huge need to do something about light commercial vehicles, utilities, and SUVs. But overall, as you can see, with trucks and with the general various categories of trucks, we're not seeing an increase in the emissions per truck. The trucks are getting bigger, but they're also getting more efficient. But we're just seeing more use of trucks and longer distances. And with the cars, we're seeing, as I said, the problem is that the benefits of some people getting more fuel efficient cars are being lost through some people buying larger and heavier vehicles. So that's the background in terms of transport trends. I guess I'd like to point out some of the economics of this, because one of the, I think, most commonly made and quite spurious arguments against action on electrification of transport is that we can't afford it, or there's some huge cost. And I guess in my experience, whenever you have a change and someone only talks about the costs and not the benefits, they're obviously against it, just as anyone who only talks about the benefits and doesn't count the cost is biased in favour of it. But in this case, yes, there is a cost for transitioning our transport, but there are also large savings, and there are also very large costs we're incurring now without any change anyway. So just running through what the costs are, the first and biggest one obviously is just oil, fuel costs. So from, say, back to the 1980s, Australia at one stage with the Bass Strait oil fields had about 70% self-sufficiency on oil. But as those have dwindled and dried up, and they've not been anywhere near replaced by our share of Timor Sea fuel, Australia now imports about 91% of its fuel. Or in fact, that was as of COVID, so that's 3 years out of date. I haven't got a current figure. It's then very vulnerable to world oil prices, as we've seen with increases of cost of fuel through the war in Ukraine. We're now looking at about, as of 22, it was 38 billion for the refined oil, those petrol and diesel imports, and the crude oil that goes to Australian refineries, that was another 10 billion. So that's about 1.5% of GDP. There are other problems with our fuel supply too. We notoriously don't have a significant fuel reserve in Australia. The estimate of 68 days of fuel reserve includes all the fuel in transport, so whatever's in tankers going around on the roads, or even tankers between ports, is counted in that reserve. Another factor which needs to be borne in mind in looking at transport, if we're going to look at it holistically, is just how much we're spending on transport infrastructure. Some people talk about the cost of charging stations, but it's really completely tiny in comparison to what we already spend on infrastructure. I wasn't able to find an accurate figure for the total cost of money spent on charging stations, both public and private combined, but it would certainly be less than 1% of what we spend on the infrastructure. So transport infrastructure as of 2023 was infrastructure was 48 billion Australian dollars, and that's also about 1.5% of GDP. It's actually the highest figure in the OECD. No other OECD country spends a larger percentage of GDP on transport infrastructure. We're the highest spender on roads and the second highest spender on rail. And I'd argue that the efficiency of that should be questioned. And I guess the other obvious trend is what we're spending on vehicles. So despite people's concerns about the cost of EVs, last year was a record year for new car sales in Australia. 1.2 million vehicles sold. 55% were SUVs and 27% were utilities and large four-wheel drives. So we're down to less than 20% of car sales are actually conventional passenger sedans. And the total cost of that was 67 billion. So that's an average cost of 55,000 per car. And I think we'd all know that there will be a multiple range of electric vehicles on sale below that figure. So yes, cost is a factor, but we've already reached the point where the average car being sold in Australia today is dearer than some of the range of SUVs available. So I would strongly challenge the notion that we can't afford to transition. I think we can. And at the risk of being biased, there's the EV my wife and I bought a year ago. We didn't give Elon any money, but anyway, so in 2023, 87,000 EVs were sold, 7.2% of total sales. Average price of them was 61,000. So again, that's more than the average for all vehicles, but not massively. That's about 10% more. And obviously, a lot of vehicles were sold in a price range that could have been switched to an EV purchase. In addition, there were sorry that there's an error on the line 3 there. That should have been plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, 11,000. That's another 0.9%, and 100,000 hybrids. So overall, about a quarter of the car market now is going to some form of electric vehicle, and EV sales doubled in 2022 and again in 2023. Despite that, world EV sales, not just OECD, but across the entire world, about 10% of all new vehicles sold in 2023 were EVs. Norway, that was up to 82%. So Australia is starting this from a backward position. And I guess that's, in summary, looking at the cost question on this, some people argue that transport is taxed excessively by government and doesn't get a fair share. But if the question is, does transport pay its own way? The answer is not really. It's the other way around. Transport is probably effectively being subsidised by the tax system at present in several ways. And if you look at overall cost from an economic point of view, from the public point of view, government revenue was reported in 22 as being 28 billion from transport. That's probably a little over 30 billion in 23. And as I said before, new infrastructure was 48 billion. Of that, roads alone was 36 billion. So our spend on road infrastructure already exceeds our spend from all forms, our income from all forms of transport-related revenue. And if we look at the side of private costs, as I said before, we're already spending 48 billion per annum on fuel, 67 billion on car sales. Estimates of the cost of congestion were around 16 billion in 2016. Haven't seen a reliably updated figure that it's probably around 20 billion now. Crash costs were 31 billion in 2016. So in fact, despite all this talk about busting congestion, busting road safety would be a much better thing to do. And health impacts from vehicles almost entirely due to particulate emissions from petrol and diesel vehicles. That was estimated to be in excess of 6 billion in 2020. So if we look at the alternatives, why should you go electric? Well, the simple answer is it is by far the least emitting choice, even if we include the full life cycle costs for construction, the source of any power used, and the disposal at the end. And that includes production of the battery. Figures from different jurisdictions vary, and I know Jake has done a lot more work on this than me, but just roughly, we did some figures for South Australia, and on the one hand, it's certainly in this presentation, when we talk about the importance of getting everyone to shift from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, that is absolutely something we want to happen. But I don't want us to give the impression that it doesn't matter what we do with public transport, or if we simply aim to replace all the cars, that's the end of the story. We do really want to see a change in the transport plan and the way we plan and deliver transport services. And certainly getting a shift towards more public transport would be highly beneficial in this as well, because even the most efficient of electric cars can't beat an electric train or tram for vehicle efficiency. But you can see there overall that even where I live in South Australia, which is a relatively clean grid and relatively few emissions for each kilowatt of electricity, it's still the case that any battery electric vehicle is more efficient than all other alternatives except public transport. And I suppose if we really want to be efficient, I put in down the bottom e-bikes, which we actually calculated here, and they are probably the champ in terms of low emissions. But overall, then you can see that a combination of poor fuel quality, a lack of emission standards in the past, and a growing proportion of large vehicles means that our average emissions per vehicle is still relatively high. And I guess the other problem is how long to replace the car fleet. Even selling at 1.2 million new vehicles per year. There are 20 million on the road, so it's going to take 18 years. So I guess the point of that slide is to say that policy action is really quite urgent on this, because we need to, even if when we get to the point where there are no more petrol or diesel vehicles sold, we've got 100% zero emission vehicles being sold, it will still take 18 to 20 years beyond that before we actually have a fully net zero fleet on the road. So I'll just go through these fairly quickly, but these are some slides just in the in our climate change and transport paper, which I mentioned before. And there are many methodologies. Many countries in the world have already gone down this track years ahead of Australia. We don't, in my view, need to reinvent the wheel on this one. There are plenty of good policy approaches that are working in other countries. This is one that we've recommended called Avoid, Shift, Improve. It's the OECD's recommended approach. And you basically go through multiple steps. You try to plan to avoid the need to travel in the first place. That relates to both how you plan activity and how you plan your city. Try to plan to shift to lower energy modes. That means that even in going to electric cars, we certainly don't stop investing in public transport or active transport. And then last one, of course, improving energy efficiency. We absolutely do want to get the cars shifted to an electric propulsion. So there's a planning process developed by Glenn Lyons in England called triple access planning, which we'd strongly recommend as a way to relook at how we plan our transport systems. So that's on the avoid bit. Also, travel demand management. I'll just quickly throw in a point that economically that's something that all Australian governments have conspicuously avoided. But as a few papers in Sydney have pointed out recently, we're spending a small fortune on road tolls anyway. So the time has probably come to revisit that one. Shifting to other modes. I guess, obviously, as I said before, that's a European data, but once you realise just how relatively inefficient road passenger and freight use is, you really do want to get people to shift to other modes. And lastly, for the EVs, which I'll at this point soon hand over to Jake. Yeah, the problem is it's not that our cars aren't getting more efficient in Australia. The problem is that half of our population, literally half of all the new vehicles sold, are moving to larger, less efficient types of vehicle in the first place. And so our overall average emissions per internal combustion engine vehicle on our roads is still stubbornly high. And there really would be a large benefit in shifting to EVs. Just two final points I'd make just from a sort of a system planning point of view before I hand over to Jake. There's a comment there, do not try to replace all the cars with EVs. Australia has relatively high car ownership per person. There's no reason if we have a whole lot of two-car households that we have to immediately shift them all to electric cars. In the transitional phase, they could go from one petrol car for longer trips and one electric car to do most of the shorter trips around where they travel. And that would be a perfectly efficient solution. And secondly, in the long term, as electric vehicles range sort of resolves all issues, they could simply have the one electric vehicle and that would be sufficient. And the other thing is, do not try to replace all the utes with EVs. I would argue that the number of large four-wheel drive utilities on Australian roads is not a policy of need. It's a result of tax policy. Before tax policies changed, if you go back 20 or 30 years, utility sales were around 10 to 12% of the Australian car market. The total number of tradies in our workforce is about 8%. We're now up to 3 times that, 24 to 27% ute sales. And the vast majority of those vehicles will never visit a job site in their life. They might go to the car park at Bunnings. They're purely a vehicle choice that's driven, I believe, partly by taxation policy. So an intelligent policy shift to similarly favour electric vehicles, I think we'll soon see that change. So some people say, well, what do we do if we've got no electric utes? I would say we don't need to replace every ute with electric vehicles because the majority of utes in Australia are bought by people who don't need a ute. They're simply doing it for a tax advantage. Anyway, that's probably enough of a rant from me. Thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Jake.
Thanks very much, Scott. It's good to get a good overview from an economic point of view as well. So, Jake, if you want to swap over sharing your screen while I introduce you. Jake is the Chief Scientist at the Electric Vehicle Council. and he's also CEO of Odin Pass, which is a mobility as a service provider. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. He's worked across government, industry and academia on sustainable transport policy for the past 15 years, with a particular focus on electric vehicles. Unlike our other two doctors, Jake holds 2 PhDs, one in transport science from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and a second in transport engineering from Queensland University of Technology. So over to you, Jake.
Thank you, David, and great to be with you this afternoon. Following on from Scott's very good intro in terms of the background to the importance of decarbonising transport and the relevancy of electrification in particular, I'm going to take us through one of the key policy levers that many of us have been advocating for well over a decade now. The need for a new vehicle efficiency standard, sometimes referred to as a fuel efficiency standard, for Australia to really secure the supply of those low and zero emission vehicles. If you'll indulge me just for 1 minute before I jump into that, for those of you who are not aware of our organisation, the Electric Vehicle Council, we're the peak body that represents the EV industry. We have loosely 100 members across car and truck manufacturers, charging infrastructure providers, energy utilities, banks, financial services. We're a very broad church, effectively any corporate in Australia that is wanting to support the uptake of electric vehicles across light and heavy segments is more than welcome to join. And overall, our mission is to accelerate that electrification of transport for a sustainable and prosperous Australia. Here's just a very quick sample of some of our members. And as you can see, it is this really great broad church, which makes my job lots of fun in being able to bring together this wide range of views to understand how we can collectively move towards that electric vehicle future, and not just for light vehicles, but for that full spectrum across the transport sector. Now, in terms of the new vehicle efficiency standard, apologies if some of you are more intimately familiar with it, but I thought I would start at a relatively high level just so we're all on the same page. So in terms of background, Australia, it's probably not a surprise to you, has historically been at the back of the queue for being able to secure the supply of low and zero emission vehicles, including electric vehicles. And this has been because we've lacked this new vehicle efficiency standard. We're one of the very few developed countries in the world that hasn't had a standard, together with Russia. That is the type of company that we've been keeping. And as a result, because we haven't had that standard, we haven't had the signal to send to global car makers to be able to secure that supply into the country. So no matter how much organic demand or stimulated demand through policy levers from government, at the end of the day, Australia has been a supply constrained market because we haven't had that policy in place. The way that this standard works is that it incentivizes car makers to bring their low and particularly zero emission electric vehicles into the country, and they gain credits for doing that against a set of annual targets. And those credits aren't something that the government pays for, but they're credits that can be traded with other car makers. So you can look at it almost like a carbon trading scheme, where car makers are competing with each other in this market, and they're having to buy and sell credits in order to meet this annual target over time. So it's an efficient market mechanism. It's something that has had great success around the world We've just been laggards, unfortunately. We've had several attempts to try and bring it into place, and it's only been under the recent federal government where we've had a change and a commitment to move forward. And I would say a strong commitment. This is one of the first policies that the federal government came off the blocks with an announcement on after their election, which was great to see. Now, we represent part of the car industry, and so our members, as well as members more broadly, have publicly come out for some time supporting a standard. But I think it's important that we recognise that many of these players have supported a relatively weak standard, and that's always been the concern, that a government would implement a standard, but it just wouldn't have the teeth and it wouldn't have the stringency to really make a difference. So after committing to this policy, the government went through a relatively lengthy consultation process, lengthier than we would have liked, but this is the way it went. And they modelled 3 different options, A, B, and C. I won't bore you with the detail, but effectively B was the kind of middle option, what we would describe as moderate to strong, and that was initially what their preferred design was, that they came back particularly to industry, but to public stakeholders to get feedback on whether to take that forward. And ultimately, the government's motivation, as well as organisations like ours that have been advocating for this, is to have a standard in place to be able to deal with that supply constraint, so that we don't fall short of our climate targets. As Scott outlined, light vehicles in particular are a significant contributor, a growing contributor in terms of those emissions. And if we don't have the supply of more efficient vehicles, albeit understanding that we don't need to replace all those vehicles, but we need to replace a large majority of them with more efficient variants and ideally zero emission electric options. So where did the government land at the end of the process? They effectively came out with what was a weakening of option B, so something between the weakest at option A and their moderate option at option B. The weakening was generally in terms of the strength of the targets for light commercial vehicles. So surprise, surprise, things like utes. You can imagine that there was a particular bit of pushback because of the politics around utes in this country. And there were some SUVs that were shifted from the passenger car category into the light commercial vehicle category. Now, this overall was not something that we were necessarily wanting to see as the final kind of outcome, but I think it's important to recognise that even with those changes that weakened their option B, overall, the standard has landed in a relatively strong position. And so this is why, in part, there's always broader politics at play, but the final legislation passed unamended with the support of the Greens in May 2024. They may have got some concessions elsewhere on other pieces of legislation, but on this, they were comfortable to move forward. And again, I flag that because I do think it's important we recognise that although it may not have been perfect, we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And in this case, we have landed with something that is relatively strong. It's 2 sets of targets, one set of targets that is stronger for passenger cars and for most SUVs, and then a weaker set of targets for light commercial vehicles and some what we could call off-road SUVs. What's been legislated is that the standard will start from the 1st of January next year, but there'll be a grace period for the first 6 months and the penalties that apply, and in turn, the kind of credit trading element of the scheme won't start until the start of the new financial year, so the 1 July. There's quite a bit of media commentary out there at the moment that this is a loophole and, this is a problem, but realistically, any arbitrary date you set, there's always going to be a period beforehand where car makers probably rush to get in less efficient vehicles before the scheme starts. And so no matter where you set that date, you're always going to have that effect. The key thing here is that there is a signpost and a signal to the market of what needs to happen, and it's not too far away now. There will also be a review of the standard in 2026, and the targets have been set out to 2029. So this review will then look particularly at the next phase for 2030 to 2035. And that will obviously be happening after the next federal election, whenever that occurs in the coming year. So from the Electric Vehicle Council's perspective, what do we like? We think that ultimately this standard is robust and transparent. It didn't include a number of loopholes, things like super credits, where you would get bonuses for importing things like hybrids, off-cycle credits, where you get bonuses for doing things like using tinting on windows and a lot of extra features that are already built into most new cars. And it also didn't include air conditioning credits, which again, in some overseas schemes have been used as a little bit of a loophole to make the headline target look good, but in fact kind of white ant it with these concessions on the back end. So that's a really good outcome. It's something that we weren't sure was going to be secured in the end, but the benefit is it means that the numbers that are on the page in terms of those targets are much more real than some other schemes overseas, where the headline target might look good, but there's all these other credits that erode that stringency. The passenger vehicle targets are quite strong, and they do cover effectively 2/3 of the market. They're aligned with what the government proposed for option B. So there was no change there, which was great. They have a strong penalty rate, which was really about forcing those car makers to trade with each other and be able to have an efficient market mechanism. And that trading part is really important, because we think what better incentive than having to pay your competitor for credits whilst trying to send a signal that maybe if you invest more in electric vehicles and other low emission vehicles, you won't have to buy as many credits, or you might even be able to sell those credits and make a profit. The overall final design did save about 80% of the abatement from option B, a little bit more than 80%. So again, in the context of climate policy in Australia, this is a win and a good win. And my honest opinion is it's stronger than what we thought we could probably get, particularly given the level of pushback both in the more conservative areas of the media, as well as a number of car makers who were trying incredibly hard not to land on a standard of where the government has finally landed. So again, I think this is a good outcome for us. But that said, there are some areas that we need to keep an eye on. Those weaker targets for light commercial vehicles are going to be an issue to monitor. When I say weaker, I do want to flag that they still are going to require about a 50% reduction in the emissions rate by 2029. So that's significant. That will mean that the car makers will have to introduce a number of hybrid, plug-in hybrid and battery electric models. But whenever you've got a case where one sub-segment of the market is under a weaker set of targets than the other segment, you want to make sure you're not encouraging more people to move from, say, a car into a ute. So those kinds of shifts are the things that we want to keep a very close eye on. And this is also why we want to make sure there's transparency around the data. Right now, the car sales data in Australia is owned by the petrol car lobby group. They sell that data. They use the revenue from that data to lobby the government to do less on encouraging the uptake of electric vehicles. And in many countries, this data is collected by the government and made publicly available. That's critical for research, for policy development, and for planning. And so we would like to see the government take that on, and we really need to see that happen so that everyone in Australia has a transparent, clear view of what's happening with the market. Is it competitive? Yeah, I wanted to just put this quick graph. We particularly were advocating for the government to move us closer towards the US. And so what this graph shows is that although the targets are only up to 2029, somewhere in that 2027, 2028 range, we will approximately catch up in terms of where the US already is. With the stringency of their standard. Now, I'm not saying that the US has the best standard in the world, but they have a relatively strong standard, a standard that is trying to move their market towards having more than 50% EV sales by 2030. And as a starting point, that was a good baseline for us to set. This is approximate because there are a number of assumptions that have to go into comparing the standards between two different countries. It's not as simple as just looking at the numbers, but as a whole, I can say that we are approximately aligned with the US in a couple of years' time, which is, again, a good outcome compared to where we could have landed. So what's going to happen as a result of this standard? We can't really speculate on the different credit costs because it is a market. These will be traded and there'll be different deals, but we can calculate what will be the credits versus the debits over time. And I'm not going to spend too much time explaining the calculation behind this, but if we go into the graph, basically what we've plotted here is with the red line, the market, the overall targets that are going to be set by the standard for the market. And the blue line is a forecast of what the market will do without the standard. So this is what a company called S&P has forecast. And they are saying, regardless of whether there was a standard, this is where we think the new vehicle market in Australia will go. What we can see is that basically in 2025, 2026, and 2027, the market was already on track to meet and beat those targets. That's not saying that every car maker would, but overall, the market as a whole would beat those targets. And so over those years, we're expecting there will be a surplus of credits, and car makers are able to either sell those credits to those that aren't meeting the target, or they can bank them and they can carry them over for future years. And so the colors of this bar chart at the bottom shows that these credits that are earned in 2025, they're actually available to be used up until 2028. And so even in 2028 and 2029, where potentially the market misses the target at a whole, there will be these credits accrued that help to make it achievable. And so this again will vary from car maker to car maker. This is looking at the market as a whole. But what we know is that any kind of nonsense claim that this scheme isn't achievable is not based in the evidence. The scheme can be achieved by the market. It's going to send a strong signal, but there are going to be some car makers that are going to have to lift their game. And that's exactly the purpose. If there was not to be any change as a result of the standard, why would you do it in the first place? So it is a significant step forward. We think that it has the potential to get us on track towards achieving 50% EV sales by 2030. But let's not overemphasize that this isn't a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet solution to the market. There's always going to be a need for a kind of multi-pronged policy approach. We're currently in this stage of moving from the early adopters into more of a mass market. And that is a tricky phase because the types of consumers that are looking at electric vehicles have different views, different needs, different concerns. It's quite concerning to us at the moment that a number of state governments have prematurely removed their incentives. And I think we do run the risk of being in a situation where supply could outpace demand if we don't have this more comprehensive policy strategy in place. So consumer demand is still there for right now, but there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of FUD out there in social media and traditional media, and we've got a lot of work to do to get those more mass market consumers on this journey, that even if the vehicles are available, they might not be ready to make that decision yet. So From our council's perspective, we're going to continue to advocate for, efficient co-funding of charging infrastructure, which is a key requirement for getting that consumer confidence. We think that there'll still need to be targeted incentive programs, at least until we get closer to that kind of 25–30% market share. And we want to take a much more proactive role in addressing this misinformation out there and working with industry and other stakeholders as well as government to increase that awareness, because it's quite concerning, the level of misinformation that's out there on a whole range of issues right now, and it is starting to bite in terms of sowing those seeds of doubt amongst Australian consumers. So we've all collectively got a lot more work to do in that space. And with that, thanks for your time, and we'll get a chance to circle back to some questions after Elliot.
Great, that's a very good explanation of the system. Thank you very much, Jake. So Elliot, if you want to take over the sharing the screen, and I'll just introduce you. So Elliot has worked in transport innovation and sustainable mobility for almost 2 decades. He completed his PhD at the Centre for Accident Research and Road Safety, and is ranked by Stanford University in the top 2% of scientists globally for his impact in transport. He's a leader in bike share, micromobility, and EV charging. He's advised the Australian Prime Minister's Office on sustainable mobility, as well as the New York City Department of Transportation, the OECD, and Transport for London. So he's been around the world. He's one of the leading advisors to government on electric vehicle charging, fleet transition, micromobility, and integrated transport strategies. So thank you, Elliot. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Dave, for the invitation to speak to you all this afternoon. And also thanks, Scott, for a great presentation. I'm kind of entering the period of my life where I could be considered a grumpy old man, and it's difficult to impress me with some of these presentations. But I don't think there was anything that you said that I disagreed with, and really enjoyed that presentation. And also to Jake for bringing us all up to speed with where we're at with the NEVs. And I think, Jake, we had the same PhD supervisor for your second PhD, I suppose, Simon Washington. So thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to keep things fairly simple, given that I'm standing in between you guys and your evening meal. So I'll try and keep the time. And I just wanted to start off by saying that EVs aren't new. The EVs that we're seeing on the road, of course, are new, but this is an EV from about 1907 or so, and it was really a lack of good battery technology, and the extensiveness of the electrical infrastructure back in 1907 wasn't quite as good, and so petrol and diesel won the day at that time. But now, of course, we're seeing that with improved battery technology and improved charging infrastructure, EVs offer a very high value proposition to potential consumers. In terms of the overview for this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the basics around EV charging. I know that there are some people on this evening's call where you already know quite a lot about EV charging. Hopefully there'll be something new for you, but it's starting off right at the very beginning. I'll also talk about the role of government, and I think that's really important because in our experience working with local government, EV charging hasn't really found its natural home yet within the structure of local governments. And the reason why local government in particular is so important is because very often car parks, which is where charging occurs, are managed by local governments, especially for publicly accessible charging, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about this evening. And I'll also talk about what do we do for the places, particularly in the inner city areas of our major capital cities, for those suburbs that were developed before the Second World War that have a built form that often doesn't include off-street car parking. And so how do we get these sorts of suburbs like Paddington in Brisbane, or Red Hill, or Marrickville, or Surrey Hills in Sydney, or Fitzroy and Collingwood and Richmond in Melbourne, just to pick out some examples from East Coast cities. So that's a really important part. Some of these local government areas 40 or 50 or even 60% of people don't have easy access to off-street car parking. Sometimes it could be more than that. And we need a plan to enable those people to have the freedom to choose an EV for their next vehicle purchase, if they choose to purchase a vehicle at all. And I'll also talk about the balance between on-street charging versus off-street charging. This picks up on something that was kind of implied by Scott's presentation around tracking our emissions in transport. And what it shows is that our emissions started to go down a little bit during COVID, but they went straight back up again. And I've also superimposed what a 43% reduction in emissions, which of course is the Commonwealth target emissions overall in the economy, not specific to transport. But if transport can't meet that target, then other parts of the economy have to work even harder so that the average emissions is a 43% reduction by 2030 from 2005 levels. And you can see in the far right-hand side, when you compare where we're headed in 2030 in terms of emissions compared to where that lower red line is for the 43% reduction, you can see that huge gap. And I don't think I've met any transport analysts that have said that we've got any chance of meeting that 43% reduction target, even if every single new car that's purchased from tomorrow was an EV. We still wouldn't meet the target for the very reason that Scott identified, which is that the churn rate is about 4% each year. So you need to start this process a lot earlier than 2024 in order to reach that 2030 target. In terms of the different pathways for reducing emissions, I know that tonight's focus is going to be on EVs, but there are really 4 pathways through which transport emissions can be reduced. So you can improve fuel efficiency. So that's what EVs are. That's an example. If you convert, if you change your car from an internal combustion engine to an EV, that's an example of fuel efficiency. You can also change mode. Again, something that Scott was mentioning with e-bike. So if you leave your car at home and take a trip by a bike or an e-bike or an e-scooter or a public transport trip, that's an example of changing mode and reducing emissions at the same time. You can also reduce VKT, and I guess most of you tonight, given the audience, will know what VKT stands for, but those that don't, vehicle kilometres travelled. You can reduce vehicle kilometres travelled by shopping or visiting somewhere that is closer to your home than a more distant location. That's an example of reducing emissions by reducing the amount of travel that you do per trip. And you can also do what I imagine a lot of you are doing tonight, which is telecommuting or working from home and joining in via the web, which is what we're all doing tonight. So that's an example of avoiding a trip and reducing emissions by doing so. This is an image that we developed for the City of Melbourne when we were auditing their transport emissions. And I think some of you have probably seen it before. The black balloons are proportional to the amount of emissions in terms of grams of CO2 per person kilometre travelled. And so the reason per person kilometre travelled, the way that changes this graph is you can see the average Victorian car on the far left-hand side and the size of that balloon. If you have the same car, but you've got 2 people in it, then the size of that balloon is halved. So the grams of CO2 per person kilometre travelled is halved. This is done a while ago. So we've also, the main change from 2018, which is when this graph was produced, and now is that the dirtiness or the carbon intensity of the grid has improved considerably since that time. So if you charge an electric vehicle with ordinary grid electricity, the black balloon is now a bit smaller in 2024 than what it was in 2018, which is really good news. But of course, a lot of people that drive EVs are charging from renewable energy and therefore don't have any black balloon. You can also see that there are some strong performance from public transport. The reason tram doesn't have any black balloon is because this is done for Victoria, and in Victoria, our trams, all the electricity is offset from a large-scale solar farm. You can also see walking, cycling is very small, either no balloon or even you charge per e-bike with dirty brown coal from Victorian electricity. You have a very small black balloon there, 6 grams of CO2 per person kilometre travelled. Then at the bottom of this graphic, you can see some footprints. It's not the carbon footprint, it's actually the space consumption footprint. So it's represented in meters squared per occupant, per passenger is another way of describing it. So again, public transport performs very strongly here. Walking and cycling too performs strongly. And it's just to contextualize that if you drive an EV, then you still have the same space consumption as an ordinary petrol or diesel vehicle. So just to put that in context, because a lot of cities are looking to reduce their congestion, and a good way of doing that is by looking at more space efficient forms of transport. So if you have a row of petrol and diesel vehicles, such as what we've got in this picture, and you're able to magically wave a wand and convert them all to electric vehicles in an instant, then the sort of scene that you've got here would be converted to something more like this. So it's the same thing, it's just they don't have tailpipe, exhaust pipes. So it's just not to say that EVs aren't good and that we shouldn't do everything we can to try and convert our dirty petrol and diesel vehicles to EVs. It's just to help put into context what sort of outcome can be expected if we put all of our eggs in one basket. And so what I'm really trying to say here is that we need to be doing more with less space resources and also less energy resources as well. And that means a multimodal transport system where people have the freedom to be able to use walking, cycling and public transport, as well as car use, preferably EV. When you look at EV sales, they have been rising very fast, obviously from a very low base, but we're in last year looked at around just under 9% of all new vehicles sold were EV, and this is a graph that's been prepared by the Electric Vehicle Council. This one has as well. This looks at EV sales in terms of market share for new vehicles for different jurisdictions in Australia. And the reason I've got this up is because I think it was early this year or last year where the Victorian EV road user charge was introduced, I think in was it June or July 2021. It was around for a while until the High Court struck it out as being unconstitutional. But when you look at the adoption rates for Victoria versus other states, there really wasn't much change at all due to the EV charge. So thankfully, it didn't really have much effect in terms of dampening sales of EVs. With the new Commonwealth Government, we've also had our first EV strategy, and I won't go through all the detail in there, but I'll just highlight, I think the most important thing in that document was what Jake was talking about, which is the new fuel efficiency standards for new light vehicles. And that's really important. That's going to be the game changer. It's going to bring in a lot of the models. For those of you that have been on holiday in Europe over the last year or two, you would have no doubt seen lots of models of EVs that you never see in Australia because there's been no real incentive for those car companies to bring them in. And it's this policy change that will change that and bring in cars like a Volkswagen, for example, where you can see lots of EV Volkswagens in Europe but you can't see any yet in Australia. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit about charging infrastructure. So there's a perception, I think, amongst some local governments and state governments that fast charging is always better than slow charging. We take a different approach at the Institute, and we say that you want the right speed of charge for the typical duration of stay. So if somebody's going to have their car parked outside their home for 8 hours or 12 hours, there's no need to have a fast charger, as long as you can be fairly certain that if you come in with, say, 10 or 12% state of charge in your battery, that when you need to leave in the morning at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, you're going to have a 90% charge or 100% charge, then that's really all you need. And anything faster than that is unnecessary. So you've got different levels of charge. You can have everything from a standard power point. So most people, some people aren't aware that you can just charge an EV with the standard power point. It will take a while, but it can be done. And if you charge regularly, then that might be sufficient for your needs. You can also get an electrician to install for maybe $2,000 or $3,000, depending upon your situation, a dedicated EV charger in your garage, which will add in somewhere between 30 and 45 kilometers of range per hour, depending upon the efficiency of your car. And then you can move to faster forms of AC charging. So there's AC and DC charging. To put it bluntly, AC charging is slower and DC charging is faster. You can have faster forms of AC charging up to 22 kilowatts. But not many EVs will be able to accept that charge. It commonly taps out at about 11 kilowatts, which adds in around 60 kilometers of charge per hour. And then you move into DC charging. So if you're on a highway, for example, and you're taking a long road trip and you don't really want to be spending 4 or 6 hours waiting for your EV to charge, that's where DC charging comes in. It's much more expensive to provide, and it's the sort of thing that local governments will do, often with financial encouragement from state or Commonwealth governments, and usually with the inclusion of a charge point operator that will manage the process and operate the charger. And these chargers can be very expensive. So they can cost up to $700,000 per charger for some of those 350 kilowatt chargers. And a lot of that cost is upgrades to the electrical system to enable charging of that speed. So that's like having about 100 air conditioners all running at the same time for those 350 kilowatt chargers. So it's very energy intensive, but it is required both for if you've got, say, a charging station alongside the Hume Highway where people aren't really going to want to spend a lot of time there, or for the emergence of heavy battery electric vehicles, and they obviously have a larger battery and so have a higher requirement for a faster rate of charge. This is a little bit old. What we're starting, or what we will begin to see over the next few years, is the introduction of megawatt charging, which is roughly 3 times as fast as the fastest charger that's available at the moment in Australia. And they'll be there really to support heavy electric vehicles that need to get a lot of charge in a small amount of time. In terms of plug types, there's a kind of a concern, mainly amongst people that don't drive EVs, that there's a whole range of plug types and a lot of incompatibility. That plug war is largely over, and we've essentially settled as an industry on type 2 plugs for AC, slow charging. And when you need to use a fast charger, it's almost always a CCS plug, which is by far and away the most common type. And then for people that drive a Japanese car like a Nissan Leaf, they have the CHAdeMO plug, which only represents about 1% of all DC charging sessions in the public domain use that charging plug type. And there is the emergence of a adapter that would allow somebody with a CHAdeMO vehicle to be able to plug into a CCS charger. And the new standard from the Commonwealth for Commonwealth funded chargers is to offer about 75% of the plugs at a charging station should be CCS to better enable the predominant plug type for DC charging to be able to use those chargers without instances of queuing. So there's been a rapid increase in the number of chargers in Australia over recent years. This looks at the fast charging situation a few years ago, and now it looks like this. So these are just chargers that offer a 50 kilowatt DC charger or greater. Some of these chargers, like the one just south of Alice Springs, are using really innovative technology like solar, lithium batteries, and then a diesel backup generator in cases of long periods of overcast weather. So there's a range of different options, but you can see here that now you can get to a large proportion of the country using the DC charging network. But most charging actually happens at home. So if you're a motorist in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide, for almost all of your trips, you'll be out of the most convenient and cheapest place to charge will actually be at home. And even though a charger like this might take 8 or 9 hours to charge a vehicle from empty to full, in reality, it actually doesn't take that long when you think about it. It's really just 15 seconds to plug in and 15 seconds to unplug at the end of your charging session. And that's really how long it actually takes, because you're doing something else while that vehicle is charging. We like to break up the charging market into 3 different types. So you've got a passing through motorist, somebody that's taking that long road trip. They're going to need a fast charge because they don't want to spend a long time on the side of the Hume freeway or another highway or freeway in Australia. Then you've got an opportunistic charger. That's somebody that charges up their EV a little bit like someone might charge up their mobile phone, where you might plug it in at work, not because you're running empty, but because it's just convenient for you to charge there. And you know that if you charge now, you won't have to charge later, and they might plug it in when they're at 40%. So that's an opportunistic charger. And then finally, and something that I'll talk about in the last few minutes that I've got available, is the local resident that doesn't have off-street car parking. This just gives you a conceptual idea of how you can structure your charging network to mimic the typical duration of stay for different land uses. So for things like an airport, where you've got some people that are coming in, they're only going to spend 15 or 20 minutes there, and then you've got other people that might be parking their car overnight. You can have a diversity of different charging speeds, and then you've got other areas where you really only need one speed of charger, because almost all vehicles that go there will be spending a long time there, like detached housing, which is pictured in the far left-hand corner of this graph. I'm just going to move through this in the interest of time, and talk about households that don't have off-street car parking. So this is an example. I'm sure some of you have seen instances similar to what I'm showing you on the slide here, where somebody that has an EV, they don't have a place to park it, and they're running an extension cord out of their front bedroom over the footpath and into their car. Not really ideal, but understandable when local governments haven't quite got to the point of being able to provide EV charging for these residents. So what we try and do, and we've worked with quite a few inner city councils to help them understand the nature of this problem and how to solve it. So we look at housing typology to look at where are the clusters of houses that don't have off-street car parking. And ideally, we're looking for locations where you're within walking distance of those houses. So we're not necessarily expecting that the charging can be installed right outside somebody's home, but as long as it's within, say, 200 metres of somebody's home, that seems like a reasonable outcome. We think about this as something that can be installed either at the curbside, such as the New South Wales curbside charging program that's being rolled out at the moment, or in an off-street car park. And we suggest in these early days of EV adoption that you can look at, councils can look at a demand responsive system, similar to what the City of Stonington have been doing in Melbourne, where they ask residents, where would you like to have curbside charging installed? It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily get a charger exactly where they've asked for it, but if you get a cluster of residents that are all asking for it in a location that you know has off-street parking challenges, then that gives you some good insight into where it might best belong. And then I might just finally end the presentation just by talking about something that we've noticed as a common issue amongst a lot of councils that have for a long time had an ambition to increase the proportion of trips by walking and cycling, and they're concerned that the introduction of EVs and EV charging might somehow derail their efforts to increase levels of active travel. And what we've done is just got a couple of examples from our work that we've done in the Netherlands, where we've picked out places that have excellent cycling levels, so 60 or 70% of trips done by bike, but in the same location or within 400 metres of the location where you can see all those cyclists there, you've got curbside charging. So rather than it's one or the other, you can actually have both. So electric cars, they're not the answer to reducing emissions, but you can't get there without them. I think that's the important point. And there are plenty of examples of where you can have cities that have very high rates of cycling. Groningen in the north of the Netherlands actually has the highest proportion of trips done by bike anywhere in the world, but it also has plentiful EV charging at the curbside, such as the picture you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. Also, just finally, main streets are not the place for EV charging. So often local councils are thinking, well, this is a prominent part of the community, maybe we should put the EV charging there. But it's actually much better to prioritise place-based outcomes and sustainable transport outcomes in the form of protected bike lanes or dedicated public transport corridors in these areas, and use off-street parking locations or residential streets for curbside charging rather than the main streets of a community. And I'll just finish off with some examples of different parts of the world. London use lampposts very often. We don't really have hollow lampposts in the way that they do in London, so it's not quite as easy. In the Netherlands, there's an interesting innovation of putting a charger in a private property, but with an arm that swings about 2.5 meters above the level of the footpath to offer charging for those that don't have an off-street car park. And in the bottom is a picture of what they do in Oslo. And Oslo, of course, is interesting because around 85% of all new vehicles sold in Norway are EV. I'm just going to end now with one key issue that I know confuses a lot of councils is, should we provide EV charging at no cost to the user, so free, or should we apply a cost? And we always argue that it's better to apply a cost because the development of a good charging network isn't without cost. It does cost money, and it also distorts people's travel behaviour. If you offer charging in one local government area, people will drive unnecessarily to that area to get that free charge. And it also means that that council or other agency of government it will mean that they own the charging network, because you won't get the commercial sector coming in because it's very difficult to compete with free. So I think I might just end there, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions with the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Elliot. That was fantastic. Yes, we've still got a bit of time for some discussion. And there's a few questions that have come through on the Q&A. If you've got any other questions, feel free to put them into the system by pushing the Q&A button. Firstly, can we talk about how the Australian NVES system compares to the Japanese and European markets? You made a bit of a comparison with the American market. Scott has put a couple of comments into the Q&A, but Jake, have you got any other comments about the comparison between our scheme and Japan and Europe?
Yeah, so the Japanese standard is relatively weak in global terms. So our standard will actually be far stronger than theirs. And in terms of the EU, we won't catch up to them within the time frame of the targets that are set, but we should get very close by 2030 or just after 2030, because the US and the European standards, at least in terms of the headline targets, are pretty close to converging in that kind of 2030 period. But the big caveat in that is that's at a headline target level. There's a lot of complexity and detail behind each of those standards. That means when that washes out, it's not exactly the same. But you know, for all intensive purposes, we're in the right ballpark here, and that's a good position to be starting from. But there's always room for improvement.
Oh, any other comments, Scott or Elliot?
No, I'm okay.
I just add one in my comment that I think it's an important point about this whole thing. Apologies if Jake said that, but I'll just repeat it. Someone asked, how much it would cost government to put these sort of things in place. The answer is zero, because basically if the scheme works and everyone meets the targets, then there's no penalty or subsidy to the manufacturers of the vehicles. The point is that if they fail to meet the target, there's a penalty on the manufacturer at the sort of whole brand level that would be imposed. But at no point will this sort of have a tax impact on government or anything like that. So there's a bit of disinformation, I think, being spread on that one, as Jake hinted.
Yeah, definitely the credits, so any kind of revenue that a car maker is to make, that is from selling those credits to other car makers. And I think that's actually one of the strong benefits of this type of standard, is because you're playing the car makers off each other, and that's what you want. You want competition to supply more efficient vehicles, and again, that's why I say, what better way than having to be forced to pay your competition because they're doing better than you.
Exactly, but all of that's an internal thing between the car makers. So no car buyer or the government is going to have to fork out for those credits at any point. It's purely an internal transfer from one car maker to another.
So have any of you got comments on Lindsay's question about the vulnerability of this whole scheme to political threats during the election cycle? What's involved in the scheme goes out to the year 2029. But even then, the ministers can probably change some of the elements of the scheme in the meantime. Let's talk a bit about the political aspect. Jake?
Yeah, I can kick us off. The coalition, who's the alternative government, consistently have opposed the standard, and in particular, the shadow Transport Minister Bridget McKenzie has been very vocal in not supporting this standard. So I think we cannot underestimate the reality that if there was a change in government, there would be a potential challenge to the legislation. That said, I think given, and this is just my personal read on Australian politics, so take that as what it's worth. I think the gap and the competitiveness of the election is relatively tight, but unlikely that either party would get a majority in the Senate. And so as long as in the Senate, there is a mix that ensures that there can't be major changes to the standard, and I'm relatively confident that will occur coming out of the next election, we shouldn't see a change. But certainly that 2026 review point would be an interesting review to go through if there was a change in government. And so we would have to see what that would entail.
I might also just jump in and say that as long as there's enough time between the 1st of January and the next election, if we start to see the introduction of lower cost EVs that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise, then it may become a little bit more complicated for the coalition, because if they see that introduction of lower cost EVs, which a lot of consumers would like, especially with the cost of living crisis, so lower purchase price and then lower operating costs compared to petrol or diesel, and they don't see dramatic increases, as I don't think they will, dramatic increases in petrol or diesel vehicles, it's hard to know why, other than purely for political reasons, why they would repeal it. So if we can get Australians used to seeing the introduction of $25,000 or $28,000 new battery electric vehicles, it could become complicated to then take that standard away, because it may threaten the availability of those lower cost EVs in the Australian market.
I'd also add to that it's not just the EVs. As Jake pointed out, the efficiency standard applies to the petrol and diesel vehicles as well. And we have one of the most inefficient petrol and diesel fleets in the Western world. So even people who are just going to wind up buying a petrol or diesel powered vehicle in the next few years, once this standard comes into place, we're literally seeing some makers not bring their most efficient models here at present. So every segment of the market is going to benefit from this, whether people realize that or not, once it's in place. I think the only people objecting to it are those who are importing high emission vehicles now, who don't have a low emission alternative to introduce here. They're obviously the ones fighting it. But all consumers would be better off, whether you are buying an ICE or an electric vehicle.
I mean, a good example of what you've just said, Scott, is the Ford F-150, which in America, the model there is more powerful and more efficient than the one that they bring in to Australia. So I think it's very difficult to argue why you'd want to get rid of the system that would allow Australians to have more, even if you want to start talking about, appeasing the segment of the electorate that is interested in really powerful, very large utes, you actually get a more powerful, more efficient F-150 with those standards that the coalition is interested in potentially repealing.
And they had a pretty intense whack at trying to scare the government from moving forward over the course of this year, standing with car dealers and making their claims about it being a ute tax and a range of other tactics. And at least my read and many that have been in that space have said that, you know, it really didn't get that much traction in the public. Of course, there were segments of the public that are always going to be, you know, impacted and affected by that messaging. But overall, in general, it wasn't that effective. So for them to go back and try and prosecute that again wouldn't seem like a winner for them. So wouldn't rule it out completely, but they didn't have much success this year in trying to stall it.
So while we're talking about politics,
just very quickly to add to that, what I will say is there will be a scare campaign on this issue for the election. So I just want to make that very clear. There will be a scare campaign. That is very clear, and there are other actors in the market that will run that scare campaign, even if it's not the coalition doing it directly. So we can't be naive to that.
And I just finally add
while we're talking
as
about,
long as everyone understands that.
You go.
As long as everyone understands the scare campaign will be fiction. I mean, financially, as we're just saying, it is just false. I mentioned we bought a Nissan Leaf. It cost $52,000 in South Australia when we bought it. We got a $3,000 subsidy, so that was $49,000 on the road. Same car in England with the system operating there with the credits costs, when you convert it, 44,000 Australian dollars. It's an identical car. There's no other change. So same car, 20% cheaper with the scheme in place in England. In Norway, where they have an even more aggressive scheme, 34,000. So it's 40% cheaper. So yeah, the scare campaign really is fiction in financial terms. Sorry.
Let's talk about New Zealand. John Leeswin has just posted something, and it's interesting while we're talking about the politics to consider what's happened in New Zealand, where the new coalition government has scrapped the clean car standard and then slapped EVs with a road user charge, a double whammy, that has demolished EV sales. Much of this was about their voter base, SUV and ute owners. The previous government introduced something that made the media branded a ute tax. And ute tax was something that came out in the discussion in Australia as well. How do we get away from this politicisation? Despite what you've just said in the last few minutes, is there a danger that Australia could go the same way as New Zealand? Who'd like to start with that one? Jake, again.
Point of view.
All right.
Sorry, I'd like to just quickly say the New Zealand scheme was very ambitious when it first started, and it probably did involve some actual cost penalties on some vehicles, which were effectively transferred as subsidies to other electric vehicles. And although that was revenue neutral in the sense that it wasn't pocketed by government, but nevertheless, there were some significant impacts on prices which are adverse. As Jake pointed out, the projected market trends in Australia in the next couple of years will effectively be covered within the range of likely outcomes of this scheme. So I think it's really important to get this scheme in place because it'll make long-term planning of the car market move in a particular direction. But I don't think it'll have a severe adverse impact immediately. So I think if it's a gradual process, it'll work. I mean, if you look at the history of where these schemes have been introduced effectively in the long term, they've been long-term projects. So Norway took 10 years to get to where they are now. They started back in 2012. But as long as you introduce it so that it bites, and then you just steadily, gradually increase the limit or tighten the limits, it should be effective, in my opinion. I'll shut up.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, disappointing what has happened in New Zealand, and I think yeah, it's been a real shock for the EV market over there in particular. As Scott said, they had a very ambitious scheme. It was almost kind of a vertical line, and so whilst it's difficult to say exactly what the impact of that would have been over time, I think overall it was probably pushing the needle a little bit too far. And that wasn't the sole reason why the former government got the boot, right? But these are just one of the factors where it's difficult to get that balance right. You need to have a strong signal, but if you do go too hard, that's when a number of stakeholders will have costs placed on them, and that's difficult politically to manage in the Australian context, how do we avoid that from happening? As I said, I think our political system is slightly different. As long as we have a diverse mix in the Senate, we're in a relatively safe position for the next couple of years. And hopefully, as you said, Elliot, once the benefits start to be publicly visible of what the standard is achieving, I think these kind of fear campaigns will disappear. We've just got to get to that point of it not being theoretical, but actually being visible to the public.
I think one of the ways of being able to, because only about 1% of vehicles on the road are EVs, it means that the vast majority of the population don't have a direct experience of being in or driving one of these vehicles. And one of the things that I think offers an opportunity is by having some incentives to speed up the rate of for taxis and hire cars to be EVs, really important for two reasons. One, from emissions perspective. So a taxi typically would drive about 10 times more per year than a regular vehicle. So the emissions benefit of that is much greater, but also because you're going to get 10 or 12 or more people in that vehicle per day. And there's that opportunity for people to experience an EV for the first time, either as hiring a car from a Hertz or an Avis, or using an Uber or a taxi as an EV. Getting that personal experience, I think, is really important, getting that opportunity to speak to the driver. So for those of you that have been in a taxi or an Uber where it is an EV, very often the drivers are incredibly happy with the vehicle, and they can talk from a very personal experience about how much money they're saving. And if they're having those conversations with their passengers, it helps to build a level of experience quite quickly so that people then start to think more carefully about EVs and consider EVs for their next vehicle purchase as well.
Okay, let's change tack a bit. A question here from Rami Akshalik asking, is there room for the traffic and transport engineering and planning professionals and governments to help with reducing emission output of our transport system through the operation of the road network? Is there more that can be done in that area?
I'll have a go at that one. I think it's tricky because the fundamental problem with that approach is the question of induced demand. And I guess I started out learning how to use Sidra on a Mac, or that was on a PC in 1985. So I confess to being very old, but you know, we all tried to optimize the system as much as we could for most of the 1980s and 90s, but then eventually you realize that population growth and demand growth inevitably fills in the capacity. And we now realize that even if there wasn't, that the evidence that induced demand is a real thing is real. I think we almost need to, I think, adopt a different philosophy to how we manage traffic, a bit like what the structural engineers called limit state design, whereby we plan to how do we manage efficiently a congested system, knowing that it's always going to be congested. That may not be a politically popular thing to say, but I think that's actually the reality of what we have to do. And I don't think we should aim to simply build or optimize our way out of this issue, because the overwhelming evidence in my working lifetime is that all we do is eventually we do see more traffic. And if we recognize that that's inevitable, I think we just need to get each vehicle to be as efficient as possible and to get as good alternatives to driving as possible in each urban area.
Yeah, I completely agree with Scott on that one. I think there's a real danger of induced demand, and there's also the opposite, which is disappearing traffic, where when they take away road space, it could be because of a natural disaster and they lose a freeway or a lane on a motorway. The traffic disappears. It doesn't necessarily go somewhere else. It doesn't behave like water. It more behaves like a gas that compresses or expands depending upon the amount of volume that you give it. So I think the best thing that the engineering profession can do in order to try and advance what we've been talking about this evening is to reallocate road space so that there's a diversity of different transport options for people, so that you can drive if you need to drive, but you can equally use walking, cycling, or public transport, and you have the freedom to choose those modes of transport, that's probably the best thing in terms of improving the efficiency of the space that we dedicate in our cities to transport.
Okay, look, we've just hit 6 o'clock, so I better wind things up at this stage. There's still quite a few questions that came through that I'd like to discuss, but time is not on our side. So I'll bring things to a close, and I'll just share my screen again to too many things open at once. So thank you very much for our three speakers. That's been an excellent presentation on a very important topic, and all three of you have added a huge amount of value and explanation to the background of this topic and the detail as well. The ITE-ANZ is going to hold another webinar in August. So put this date into your diary on the 27th of August, a bit of a change in pace from electric vehicles to road signing principles. We have two speakers, Tuan Nguyen and Robert Morgan, who both sit on the Australian Standards Committee for Road Signing. So if road signing is even a small part of your job, this will be an excellent webinar for you to come along to. So thank you again to all of our speakers, and we'll bring things to a close. So thank you very much.